A poor single woman braves a storm to rescue a stranded little boy, before discovering he's actually the son of a powerful billionaire CEO. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The wind roared through the narrow streets, carrying sharp needles of ice that stung Mia's face as she hunched her shoulders against the cold. Snowflakes, thick and relentless, coated the cracked pavement, turning the dimly lit road into a ghostly white blur. The storm had come in faster than expected, swallowing the city in its merciless grasp. Mia had barely made it back from her late shift at the diner, her fingers numb even inside her worn-out gloves. She fumbled with her keys, her mind already fixated on the warmth waiting inside her tiny apartment, when a sound stopped her in her tracks. A cry, faint, almost swallowed by the wind. Her head snapped up, breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought she had imagined it, just another strange whistle of the storm curling through the alleyways. But then she heard it again, thin and desperate. Not the wind. A child. Mia turned, scanning the street, but visibility was poor. Her heartbeat quickened as she stepped away from her door, her boots crunching against the thick layer of snow. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby, a small, choked-out whimper barely audible over the storm's howling fury. She pushed forward, shivering as the wind bit into her skin, until she saw a dark lump near the base of a street lamp, half buried in the growing snowdrift. A child. Mia's breath left her in a sharp exhale as she rushed forward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The boy was curled in on himself, arms wrapped around his body, his thin jacket doing little to protect him. Snow clung to his hair and eyelashes, his cheeks red with the sting of the cold. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Kneeling beside him, Mia reached out hesitantly. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice gentle despite the panic rising inside her. "Are you okay?" The boy flinched at the sound of her voice, his body stiffening. His wide, dark eyes locked onto hers, full of something between fear and exhaustion. His lips, pale and trembling, parted slightly, but no words came out. Mia's chest ached at the sight of him. "You're freezing," she murmured. "We need to get you inside." He didn't move, but when she carefully placed her hands under his arms and lifted him, he didn't resist either. He was light, too light. Mia's stomach twisted at the thought. He clung to her coat instinctively, his small fingers curling into the fabric as if he didn't even realize he was doing it. His body shook violently against hers, the cold having sunk too deep into his bones. Mia didn't waste another second. Holding him close, she trudged back through the snow, up the steps to her apartment, and kicked the door shut behind her. The warmth inside felt almost suffocating after the brutal cold, and Mia moved quickly, setting the boy down on her couch and wrapping him in the thickest blanket she could find. He didn't fight her. He barely reacted at all. That frightened her more than anything. "Just hold on," she whispered, mostly to herself as she hurried to the small kitchen, her fingers fumbling to fill a mug with hot water. Tea, cocoa, anything warm, something to bring color back to his lips. She stole glances at him as she worked, watching as his small body disappeared into the folds of the blanket, his expression dazed. He was still trembling, his breath uneven. Mia swallowed hard. Where had he come from? How had he ended up alone in this storm? She crouched beside the couch, holding out the warm mug. "Here, sweetheart, drink this." The boy hesitated, his gaze flicking between her face and the cup before he finally reached out with shaking hands. Mia steadied it for him as he took a small sip, his throat working as he swallowed. "There you go," she said softly. "That should help." The boy didn't respond. He was staring at the cup as if he wasn't sure if it was real. Mia chewed on her lip, unsure of how to proceed. She didn't want to overwhelm him, but she needed answers. "Can you tell me your name?" For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer, but then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "Theo." Her heart clenched. "Okay, Theo. That's a very nice name." She offered him a small smile, hoping to reassure him, but he just kept his eyes down, fingers curled tightly around the mug. She wanted to ask him more, where his parents were, how he had ended up outside, but something in his posture, in the haunted way he stared at the cup, made her hold back. He was terrified. Of what, she didn't know yet, but pushing him too soon wouldn't help. Instead, she reached for another blanket and draped it over him. "You can stay here tonight," she said gently. "We'll figure everything out in the morning, all right?" Theo didn't nod, didn't speak. But after a long moment, he let out a small, shaky breath and leaned ever so slightly into the warmth of the couch. Mia watched him, her mind racing with 1,000 questions she didn't have the answers to. Who was this boy? And why did she have the sinking feeling that his story was just beginning? The storm raged on through the night, snow piling against the windows, the wind rattling the panes like a restless spirit. Inside, the small apartment was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the radiator struggling against the winter chill. Mia sat in the armchair across from the couch, watching Theo as he lay curled up beneath the layers of blankets. He had barely spoken since she brought him inside, only giving her his name in that small, hesitant whisper. Even now, his tiny fingers clutched the fabric of the blanket as if afraid it might be taken away. She wanted to ask him more, to understand where he had come from and why he had been out in the storm alone, but she knew pressing him wouldn't help. He was exhausted, his body weighed down by the cold, his breathing slow and deep. It was only when she saw his hand twitch in his sleep, a faint whimper escaping his lips, that she realized how tightly wounded he was, even in rest. Mia sighed softly, rubbing her hands over her arms, trying to shake off the lingering worry. She had no idea what she had just stepped into. For all she knew, someone was out there searching for him right now, frantic with worry. But the way he had looked at her, the way he had clung to her coat when she carried him inside, it didn't feel like a child who had simply wandered away from a loving home. She stayed up for hours, watching over him, unwilling to let herself sleep just yet. Eventually, exhaustion won, and she dozed off in the chair, the distant howling of the wind fading into the quiet of her dreams. When she woke, the apartment was bathed in pale morning light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. For a moment, she forgot why she had fallen asleep in the chair, until she shifted and her eyes landed on Theo. He was awake, sitting up slightly, his small frame still wrapped tightly in the blanket. He wasn't crying or panicking, just staring at her with those large, dark eyes as if trying to make sense of her. Mia stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her back, then gave him a small smile. "Good morning." Theo didn't respond, only blinked, his fingers tightening around the fabric. She hesitated, then tried again. "Did you sleep okay?" A small nod. "Barely there." It was progress, at least. Mia shifted forward in her seat, keeping her voice light. "Theo, sweetheart. Do you know where you live?" The question made him tense, his eyes flicking away from hers, toward the window, where the world outside was nothing but a blank, endless white. She waited, hoping he would answer, but when the silence stretched too long, she tried again, softer this time. "Do you know your mom or dad's phone number? Anyone we can call?" His small hands twisted in the blanket, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time since she had found him, he looked away completely, turning his head slightly, as if he wished he could disappear into the couch. Mia's stomach nodded. Something was wrong. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. He was scared, that much was obvious, and she wouldn't get anything out of him by making him feel cornered. "Okay," she said finally, sitting back. "That's all right. You don't have to tell me right now." Theo's fingers stopped twisting the fabric, though his shoulders remained stiff. Mia knew she couldn't just keep him here, not without trying to find out where he belonged. Even if he refused to answer her, someone had to be looking for him. She had to take him to the police station, let them figure out where he had come from. But the thought of handing him over made her uneasy. She had only known him for a few hours, but something about the way he clung to silence, the way his small body had trembled in the storm, filled her with an unfamiliar protectiveness. He wasn't just lost. He was hiding something. Still, she had no other option. Why don't we have some breakfast first? She suggested, standing. Then we can go out and see if we can find your family. Theo's gaze flicked to her, something unreadable in his expression. He didn't respond, but he didn't protest either. She made scrambled eggs and toast, keeping things simple, glancing at him now and then as he picked at his food. He ate slowly, methodically, as if not used to having someone watch over him. When breakfast was done, Mia helped him into a warmer jacket, one of hers that hung too loose on his small frame but was better than what he had, and led him outside. The streets were blanketed in snow, the city quieter than usual as people dug themselves out from the storm's aftermath. The police station was only a few blocks away, the walk slow but uneventful. She held Theo's hand, more to keep him close than anything else, and while he didn't resist, he also didn't hold on too tightly. When they stepped inside the station, the warmth was almost suffocating after the cold outside. A few officers glanced up from their desks, their faces shifting from disinterest to concern the moment they noticed Theo. A woman in uniform approached them, her brows knitting together. "Can I help you?" Mia swallowed, then nodded toward the boy at her side. I found him outside last night. He was alone in the storm." The officer's eyes widened slightly as she looked down at Theo. "Sweetheart, do you know your last name? Where your parents are?" Theo didn't answer. The officer glanced back at Mia, concern deepening. "He hasn't said anything? Just his first name." She sighed, then motioned toward the waiting area. "All right, let's get him checked in, and we'll see if anyone's reported a missing child." Mia hesitated, glancing down at Theo. His small hand was still in hers, his grip just a little tighter now. She could feel the tension in his fingers, the silent fear creeping back into his expression. She didn't know why, but she squeezed his hand back. Somewhere deep down, she had the feeling that whatever came next was going to change everything. The officer led Mia and Theo to a small waiting area near the front desk, motioning for them to sit while she checked the system for missing child reports. Mia lowered herself into the stiff plastic chair, her gaze flicking to Theo, who perched silently beside her, his small hands resting in his lap. He still hadn't spoken since they left the apartment, and though he sat still, she could feel the quiet tension rolling off him. She wanted to say something, reassure him, tell him it was going to be okay, but she wasn't sure that was true. Her gut told her there was more to this than a simple case of a lost child, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Theo knew exactly where he was supposed to be. He just didn't want to go back. The officer returned a few minutes later, looking puzzled. "No reports matching his description," she said, glancing between Mia and Theo. "But let me make some calls. If he belongs to someone, they'll be looking for him." Mia nodded, ignoring the slight twist of unease in her stomach. She told herself this was a good thing. Theo deserved to be somewhere safe, and if someone had lost him, they would be relieved to know he was okay. Before she could dwell on the thought, a commotion erupted near the front doors. The sound of screeching tires echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable slam of car doors. Mia turned her head just in time to see 3 massive black SUVs pull up in front of the station, their dark windows gleaming under the morning light. The officers near the entrance exchanged glances before one of them stepped forward, hand resting near his belt as if bracing for something. The doors of the SUVs flew open in near-perfect synchronization, and a group of men in dark suits spilled out onto the pavement, moving with precision and purpose. They were tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of men who carried an air of quiet authority. Their movements were swift, practiced. Mia's heart kicked against her ribs. Everything happened fast. The station, once calm, was now thick with an energy that made the air feel tight. One of the suited men strode forward, flashing something at the nearest officer, a badge, a crest, something official-looking, and barked a low command. The officer barely had time to nod before the men swept inside. And then, he arrived. The doors of the final SUV opened, and a man stepped out, his presence like a sudden shift in gravity. He was tall, commanding, dressed in a sharp black coat over an expensive-looking suit. There was nothing rushed or frantic about the way he moved, but the tension in his jaw, the sharp cut of his features, the way his eyes scanned the room like a man accustomed to having control, all of it radiated power. Mia didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. She already knew. Damien Lancaster. She had never met him, never even been close enough to someone like him to believe their worlds could possibly intersect, but his name was everywhere. One of the most powerful billionaires in the country. A man who built empires with a flick of his wrist, whose mere presence commanded attention. He was as untouchable as the skyline that bore his name. And he was here. For Theo. Before Mia could react, before she could even process what that meant, Damien's eyes landed on Theo, and everything else in the room ceased to exist. The mask of composure on his face cracked in an instant. His sharp, assessing gaze softened, replaced by something raw, something almost vulnerable. And then, without hesitation, he crossed the room in long, powerful strides and dropped to one knee in front of the little boy Mia had carried through the storm. "Theo," he breathed, his voice lower than she expected, rough with something that sounded a lot like relief. Theo flinched, not in fear, but in the way a child does when they aren't sure if they're about to be scolded or embraced. His small fingers tightened around the edge of his borrowed coat, his lips parting, but no sound came out. Then, in one swift motion, Damien reached forward and pulled the boy into his arms. The embrace was tight, almost desperate, the kind of hold that spoke of fear, relief, and something deeper that Mia couldn't quite name. Damien's hand cradled the back of Theo's head, his jaw clenching as he exhaled a slow, uneven breath. "You scared me," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "You scared the hell out of me, kid." Theo didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away either. Mia sat frozen in place, watching as the man she had only ever seen in headlines held onto the little boy like he was the only thing that mattered. A billionaire, a man who had built a fortune so vast it barely seemed real, kneeling on the floor of a police station, clutching a child like he was afraid to let go. She had expected a worried parent. She hadn't expected this. One of the suited men cleared his throat, and Damien finally pulled back just enough to look at Theo properly, his hands still on the boy's shoulders. "You're all right?" he asked, voice steadier now, more controlled.